In a prestigious high school where fairness and respect are supposed to be the foundation, a bright black student becomes the target of cruel humiliation and racial discrimination. Amara, just 16 years old, endures harsh words and unfair treatment from the very teacher who should be guiding her path to success. But there's one thing her teacher doesn't know, a secret that could turn the entire situation upside down. When the truth is finally revealed, nothing will ever be the same. The twist waiting ahead will leave you speechless. Don't miss this powerful story. Watch until the end to uncover the truth behind what happened in that classroom. And don't forget to subscribe to this channel for more stories that inspire, move, and leave a lasting impact. In the heart of a small American town stood Ridgefield High School, a prestigious institution where academic excellence was not just encouraged but demanded. The walls of this school bore witness to countless stories of success, struggle, and sometimes injustice. Among the many students was Amara Johnson, a 16-year-old girl whose sharp intellect and quiet determination often set her apart. Amara's achievements in every subject made her a standout student, but her journey at Ridgefield was far from smooth. Amara's peers often whispered about how naturally gifted she was. Her essays were eloquent, her science projects innovative, and her ability to solve complex math problems in seconds left even the brightest of students in awe. Yet, for all her accomplishments, Amara faced an unrelenting challenge in the form of Mrs. Evelyn Carter, her English teacher. Mrs. Carter, a middle-aged white woman known for her stern demeanor, had a reputation for running a tight ship. Most students either respected her rigor or feared her sharp tongue. But with Amara, there was something more, a deep-seated bias that Mrs. Carter couldn't seem to hide. While she often lauded other students for their work, Amara's efforts were either dismissed or criticized with an air of condescension. It was a chilly Monday morning, and the air in room 304 was tense. The class was tasked with presenting their interpretation of a classic poem. When it was Amara's turn, she stepped to the front of the class, clutching her notes. Her interpretation was brilliant, weaving themes of resilience and hope that resonated deeply. As she finished, the classroom erupted in quiet applause. But Mrs. Carter's icy voice cut through the approval like a knife. "Resilience and hope?" she mocked. "I suppose you're speaking from experience, Amara. Perhaps you should spend less time daydreaming and more time dressing appropriately for a serious academic environment." The class fell silent, the students exchanging uneasy glances. Amara's heart sank. Her outfit, a simple blouse and jeans, was clean and appropriate, but Mrs. Carter's words weren't about clothes. They were about her, about Amara's very existence in this classroom. "Let me give you some advice," Mrs. Carter continued with a smirk. "Don't think that clever words or pretty metaphors will get you far in life. If you keep trying to stand out, you'll only end up making a fool of yourself." Amara clenched her fists and kept her head down, refusing to let her classmates see the tears brimming in her eyes. The room was suffocatingly quiet, broken only by the nervous shuffling of papers. This wasn't the first time Mrs. Carter had singled Amara out. For months she had been the target of what felt like deliberate acts of unfairness. While other students received detailed feedback on their essays, Amara's assignments often came back with vague remarks like, "needs improvement," or "not your best work," accompanied by unreasonably low grades. Once, during a group project, Mrs. Carter had forced Amara to take on the most menial tasks, cleaning up after her peers while others presented the final work. When Amara had tried to voice her concerns, Mrs. Carter simply waved her off, saying, "Everyone has their place, Amara. Yours isn't in the spotlight." The injustice didn't stop at academics. Amara, a skilled debater, had applied to join the school's debate team. It was no secret she was one of the best candidates, but Mrs. Carter, who was also the team advisor, had rejected her application without explanation. The spot went instead to a student with far less experience but far lighter skin. The students in the classroom weren't blind to what was happening. Many, both black and white, could see the stark contrast in how Mrs. Carter treated Amara compared to others. Sarah Thompson, a quiet girl who sat in the second row, often caught herself staring in disbelief at the way Mrs. Carter's sharp words seemed aimed solely at Amara. "She doesn't deserve this," Sarah whispered to her friend one day after class. "Then why don't you say something?" her friend shot back. "Are you kidding? You've seen what Mrs. Carter does to people who cross her. I can't risk it." This was the unspoken rule in room 304. No one stood up to Mrs. Carter. Her authority was absolute, and her punishments for defiance were swift and severe. The fear she instilled silenced even the most empathetic voices. Despite the constant barrage of negativity, Amara never let her grades slip. She worked harder, studied longer, and poured herself into every assignment. Yet the toll on her spirit was evident. At lunch, she often sat alone, pretending to read while avoiding the concerned looks of her classmates. At night, she stared at the ceiling of her room, wondering what she had done to deserve such treatment. "Maybe I should just stop trying so hard," she confided in her journal one evening. "No matter what I do, she'll always find a way to put me down." But deep down, Amara knew she couldn't give up. There was a fire in her that refused to be extinguished, a belief that she deserved better, that one day the truth would come to light. The tension in the classroom reached its peak during a particularly humiliating incident. Mrs. Carter had accused Amara of plagiarizing an essay, a claim entirely unfounded. "This is far too sophisticated for someone like you to have written," she sneered, holding the paper aloft as though it were contaminated. Amara protested, her voice shaking but firm. "I wrote every word of that paper." Mrs. Carter laughed coldly. "Then prove it. Rewrite it here in front of the class." As Amara picked up her pen, her classmates exchanged uneasy glances. Sarah, watching from her seat, felt a knot of anger tighten in her chest. For the first time, she pulled out her phone and began recording. Unbeknownst to Mrs. Carter, her actions were no longer invisible. Whispers of her behavior spread among the students, and Sarah's video soon found its way to a small but significant audience. The classroom's silence was beginning to crack. Amara didn't know it yet, but the tides were about to turn. The walls that had once echoed with Mrs. Carter's harsh words were about to bear witness to something far greater, a confrontation that would leave the entire school stunned. It was another routine day in room 304, but tension filled the air. Amara sat quietly at her desk, scribbling notes for an upcoming project, while the rest of the class buzzed with chatter. Suddenly, Mrs. Carter's sharp voice pierced through the room. "Who took this?" she snapped, holding up an elegant gold-plated pen. The students fell silent, exchanging confused glances. The pen, belonging to a classmate named Rachel, had apparently gone missing during lunch. "I know one of you has it," Mrs. Carter continued, her gaze scanning the room before landing squarely on Amara. "And I have a pretty good idea who." Amara froze, feeling the weight of Mrs. Carter's stare. Before she could respond, Mrs. Carter strode toward her desk, her heels clicking ominously against the floor. She reached into Amara's backpack without asking for permission and triumphantly held up the missing pen. "Amen. My ears are already uplifted." The class gasped. Amara's mouth fell open in shock. "I didn't take it. I don't even know where that came from," she protested, her voice trembling. Mrs. Carter sneered. "Of course you'd say that, but this is typical, isn't it? Someone like you, growing up in the environment you must have, wouldn't think twice about taking something that doesn't belong to you." The words struck Amara like a physical blow. Tears welled in her eyes as she stammered, I swear I didn't." Ignoring her, Mrs. Carter grabbed a piece of paper and slapped it onto Amara's desk. "Write a public apology," she demanded. "Right here, in front of the class. Explain why stealing is wrong and how you'll do better." Amara shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. "But I didn't." "Enough," Mrs. Carter interrupted, her voice cutting like a knife. "Don't waste my time. Start writing." The rest of the class sat frozen, unsure of how to react. Most of them knew Amara wasn't capable of such a thing, but Mrs. Carter's authority left them paralyzed. Some looked away, uncomfortable. Others stared at their desks, silently wishing they had the courage to speak up. In the back row, however, Sarah gripped her phone tightly under her desk. She couldn't take it anymore. Discreetly, she opened her camera app and began recording the scene. Every word, every humiliating moment was captured in sharp detail. Amara picked up her pen, her hands trembling, and stared at the blank paper before her. "I didn't do it," she whispered again, more to herself than anyone else. Her tears finally spilled over, running down her cheeks. Mrs. Carter smirked. "If your parents had taught you better, maybe you wouldn't be in this situation," she said cruelly. The comment was too much. Amara stood abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "You don't know anything about me," she shouted, her voice breaking. "You don't know my family, and you have no right to say those things." Mrs. Carter's expression darkened. "Sit down, young lady, unless you want me to call the principal right now." Amara hesitated, then sank back into her seat, defeated. She stared down at the paper, her tears smudging the ink as she reluctantly began to write. The incident left Amara shaken, but she refused to let Mrs. Carter completely break her spirit. A few days later, the school announced a debate competition with the theme Equality in Education. Amara's eyes lit up when she heard the topic. She knew she had the skills and the passion to deliver a powerful speech. After class, she approached Mrs. Carter's desk. "I'd like to sign up for the debate competition," she said, her voice steady despite her nerves. Mrs. Carter didn't even look up from her papers. "The roster's full," she said curtly. Amara frowned. "But I thought the deadline to sign up was tomorrow." Mrs. Carter finally glanced at her, her expression one of thinly veiled disdain. "I don't think this competition is a good fit for you, Amara. Public speaking requires confidence and a certain level of articulation. Perhaps you should focus on improving your grades instead." Amara felt her chest tighten with anger and frustration. "I deserve a chance to participate," she insisted. Mrs. Carter's lips curled into a patronizing smile. "Perhaps next time. For now, I've already assigned the last spot to someone else." Amara clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. She knew the student Mrs. Carter had chosen, a boy named Ethan, was far less experienced and hadn't even expressed interest in the competition until that morning. As Amara walked away, she caught the sympathetic glances of her classmates. She could see the frustration in their eyes, but no one said a word. The injustice didn't sit well with Sarah. She had spent days replaying the video she'd recorded of Mrs. Carter humiliating Amara, torn between wanting to do something and fearing the consequences. But watching Mrs. Carter deny Amara the chance to compete in the debate was the final straw. That night, Sarah sat in her room, staring at her phone. Her heart raced as she uploaded the video to an anonymous account and shared it on a popular local forum. "This needs to stop," she whispered to herself as she hit post. The video quickly gained traction. Within hours, it had hundreds of views and dozens of comments. Parents, students, and even some teachers were outraged by what they saw. The next morning, the school's administration was flooded with calls and emails demanding action. When Mrs. Carter arrived at school the next day, she noticed the strange way her colleagues avoided her gaze. Students whispered in the hallways, their eyes darting toward her before quickly looking away. Something was clearly wrong. By lunchtime, the principal's office had summoned Mrs. Carter for an urgent meeting. She strode into the office, feigning confidence, but her composure faltered when she saw the printout of the form post on the desk. "Explain this," the principal demanded, sliding the paper toward her. Mrs. Carter's face turned pale as she scanned the post. "This is ridiculous," she said, her voice shaking. "It's clearly been taken out of context." "Context or not, this behavior is unacceptable," the principal replied firmly. "We've received complaints from parents and students, and the school board has been notified. There will be an investigation." Mrs. Carter left the office in a daze, her usual air of superiority replaced by a growing sense of dread. Meanwhile, Amara had no idea what was unfolding behind the scenes. She continued to attend class, her head held high, despite the lingering sting of Mrs. Carter's words. She hadn't given up on the debate competition either. With the encouragement of a few supportive classmates, she prepared a speech anyway, just in case she got the chance to participate. Unbeknownst to her, the tides were beginning to turn. The video had sparked a movement within the school community. Students who had once stayed silent about Mrs. Carter's behavior began sharing their own stories. Parents demanded accountability, and even some teachers started questioning whether Mrs. Carter belonged in a classroom. Amara's journey was far from over. As the walls of injustice began to crack, the stage was set for a confrontation that would shake Ridgefield High to its core. The truth was out, but the real question remained. Would justice finally prevail? The tension in Ridgefield High had reached its breaking point. The video exposing Mrs. Carter's actions had sent shockwaves through the school and beyond. Parents demanded answers, students whispered nervously in hallways, and the administration scrambled to address the growing outrage. In the center of it all was Amara. Unaware that the truth about her life and the people around her was about to come to light in the most unexpected way. It was a crisp Friday afternoon when the school announced a mandatory meeting involving teachers, parents, and students to address the accusations against Mrs. Carter. The auditorium buzzed with chatter as people filed in, filling the rows of seats. Parents exchanged worried looks, students whispered among themselves, and teachers sat stiffly, unsure of what to expect. At the center of it all sat Mr. Howard, the school's principal. A man of integrity and respect, he had always been known for his fairness and composure. Today, however, there was a gravity in his expression that hinted at something deeper. As the meeting began, the crowd fell silent. Mr. Howard addressed the room with his usual measured tone. "We are here today to discuss a matter of great importance," he began. "The recent allegations against one of our teachers, Mrs. Carter, have raised serious concerns about the values we uphold as an institution." Mrs. Carter, sitting near the front, crossed her arms defiantly. Her expression was one of indignation, as though she were the victim in the scenario. She glanced around the room, daring anyone to challenge her. As the discussion unfolded, Amara was called to the stage to recount her experiences. The room grew eerily quiet as she walked to the podium. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice was steady as she began. "I've always loved learning," Amara said, her voice carrying a quiet strength. "But in Mrs. Carter's class, I often felt like I didn't belong. No matter how hard I worked or how much effort I put into my assignments, it never seemed to be enough." She paused, gathering her courage. The incident, with the pen, I didn't take it. And the things Mrs. Carter said to me that day, about my family, about my character, were not just unfair. They were cruel. Amara's words hung in the air, and a ripple of discomfort passed through the audience. Mrs. Carter, however, remained unfazed. When Mr. Howard invited her to respond, she rose from her seat with an air of righteous indignation. "This is absurd," Mrs. Carter said, her voice sharp and dismissive. "I have always treated my students fairly. If Amara felt otherwise, perhaps it's because she struggles to accept constructive criticism. Not everyone can handle the truth." She turned to face the audience, her tone growing colder. "And let's be honest here. Children like her coming from certain backgrounds often need to learn discipline and respect. Maybe I was harsh, but I was trying to teach her valuable lessons about the real world." The room was stunned into silence. The veiled racism in Mrs. Carter's words was unmistakable. Some parents gasped, others shook their heads in disbelief. Amara stared down at her hands, fighting back tears. Mrs. Carter delivered her final blow. Children like Amara need to know their place. That's the only way they'll succeed in life. Just as the tension in the room reached its peak, Mr. Howard stood. His usually calm demeanor was replaced by an intensity that commanded attention. Slowly, he walked to the stage, his footsteps echoing in the hushed auditorium. "Enough," he said, his voice firm but controlled. "I cannot remain silent any longer." All eyes were on him as he turned to face the crowd. "There's something I need to share, something that will put this situation into perspective." The room buzzed with curiosity. Mrs. Carter narrowed her eyes, sensing that the situation was slipping out of her control. Mr. Howard took a deep breath and began. "Amara Johnson is not just one of our brightest students. She is also my daughter." Gasps rippled through the room. Amara's head snapped up, her eyes wide with shock. Mrs. Carter froze, her face a mask of disbelief. Mr. Howard continued, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Amara's mother was my best friend, a brilliant woman who faced far too many challenges because of the color of her skin. When she and her husband tragically passed away in an accident, I made a promise to them that I would raise Amara as my own. She has been my daughter in every way that matters." He turned to Mrs. Carter, his gaze piercing. "I chose not to share this publicly because I wanted Amara to have a normal school experience, free from favoritism or judgment. But today, I realize that my silence has allowed injustices to thrive in my own school." Amara sat frozen, her mind racing to process the revelation. She had always known Mr. Howard cared for her deeply, but she never imagined the lengths he had gone to protect her. Mr. Howard stepped closer to Mrs. Carter, his voice filled with quiet fury. "If you believe that a person's worth can be determined by their skin color or background, then you have no place in this school. Your words and actions have not only hurt my daughter, but have betrayed the values we stand for as educators." Mrs. Carter's face turned crimson. She opened her mouth to respond, but found no words. Mr. Howard turned back to the audience. "Let this be a reminder to all of us. Our role as educators is not just to teach subjects, but to instill values, respect, empathy, and equality. And we cannot allow prejudice to undermine that mission." The room erupted into applause. Parents stood, clapping and cheering. Students whispered excitedly, their faces lighting up with admiration for both Mr. Howard and Amara. Mrs. Carter, realizing the tide had turned against her, quietly slipped out of the auditorium, her head bowed. The school board would later announce her suspension pending an investigation. Amara, still in shock, felt a hand on her shoulder. She looked up to see Mr. Howard smiling down at her, his eyes filled with pride. "You've always been strong, Amara," he said softly. "Now, the world knows it too." The truth had finally been revealed, but this was only the beginning. As the dust settled, Amara and Mr. Howard prepared to face the challenges ahead, knowing that their fight for justice and equality was far from over. The day after the explosive meeting, Ridgefield High School announced Mrs. Carter's immediate suspension. The decision was accompanied by a public statement acknowledging the serious allegations against her and committing to a thorough investigation. Word spread quickly through the school and the surrounding community, fueled by the viral video of her mistreatment of Amara. Local news outlets picked up the story, broadcasting the footage on television and across social media platforms. Parents and alumni, many of whom had admired Ridgefield High for its academic excellence, were appalled. Pressure mounted on the school board to take decisive action. Mrs. Carter became the center of a storm she couldn't escape. Online petitions demanded her permanent removal, while parents flooded the school with emails and calls. Reporters showed up at her doorstep, seeking her side of the story. Under immense scrutiny, Mrs. Carter refused to comment, retreating into the shadows. In the days following the meeting, whispers about the identity of the person who leaked the video grew louder. Students speculated, but no one came forward until Sarah, the quiet girl who had secretly recorded the incident, decided she couldn't stay silent any longer. One afternoon, during lunch, Sarah stood up in the cafeteria. The room fell silent as she spoke. "I'm the one who recorded and shared the video of Mrs. Carter," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "I did it because what happened to Amara wasn't right, and someone had to do something." Her confession was met with a mix of surprise and admiration. Many students clapped, while others looked at her with newfound respect. Amara approached Sarah, her eyes shining with gratitude. "Thank you," Amara said softly. "You didn't have to risk yourself for me, but you did. That means more than I can say." Sarah smiled, relief washing over her. "You didn't deserve what she did to you. No one does." As the investigation into Mrs. Carter's behavior continued, the school board held a press conference to address the incident and its wider implications. Among the speakers was Amara, who had been invited to share her perspective. Standing before a crowd of reporters and cameras, Amara felt a mixture of nerves and determination. She took a deep breath and began to speak. "First, I want to thank everyone who has supported me during this difficult time," she said. "What happened to me in Mrs. Carter's classroom was painful, but it's not just about me. It's about every student who has ever felt less than because of their race, their background, or who they are." The audience listened intently as she continued. "I could stand here today and call for punishment, for retribution, but I won't, because hatred can never heal the wounds it creates. The only way we can truly change the world is through love and understanding." Amara's voice grew stronger. "We have to hold people accountable for their actions, yes, but we also have to give them the chance to learn, to grow, and to be better. That's what education is supposed to be about." Her words resonated deeply, leaving many in the audience teary-eyed. Reporters rushed to capture every word, and the clip of her speech quickly went viral, earning her widespread praise for her wisdom and compassion. Amara's courage and resilience didn't go unnoticed. Within weeks, she received news that she had been awarded a full scholarship to a prestigious university, recognizing not only her academic achievements, but also her leadership and character. The scholarship was a life-changing opportunity, opening doors to a future she had only dreamed of. At the same time, Mr. Howard announced a new initiative in honor of Amara's late mother. The Ruth Johnson Scholarship Fund would provide financial support to underrepresented and disadvantaged students, ensuring they had access to the education and opportunities they deserved. During the launch event for the scholarship program, Mr. Howard spoke from the heart. "Ruth Johnson was one of the most remarkable people I've ever known. Her strength, kindness, and determination inspired everyone around her. This scholarship is a tribute to her legacy and a commitment to creating a better, fairer world." Amara stood beside him, beaming with pride. The program was a powerful reminder that even in the face of injustice, progress was possible. As the weeks passed, the school board completed its investigation into Mrs. Carter's conduct. The findings were damning, revealing a pattern of biased and discriminatory behavior that had gone unchecked for years. She was officially terminated from her position, and the state revoked her teaching license. While Mrs. Carter issued a brief statement expressing regret for her actions, it was clear that her career in education was over. The community moved on, determined to rebuild trust and ensure that such behavior would never be tolerated again. The story of Amara and Mrs. Carter became a symbol of resilience, justice, and hope. It sparked important conversations about racism in schools and the responsibility of educators to create inclusive environments. Amara's speech was quoted in articles, shared on social media, and even used in classrooms as an example of how to respond to hate with grace. In an interview with a major news outlet, Amara reflected on her journey. "I've learned that staying silent in the face of injustice only allows it to grow. But fighting back doesn't mean meeting hate with hate. It means standing up for what's right, with love, strength, and determination." The story concludes with a poignant moment between Amara and Mr. Howard. On the evening before she leaves for college, they sit together on the porch of their home, watching the sun set. "You've come so far," Mr. Howard says, his voice filled with pride. "Your mother would be so proud of the woman you've become." Amara smiles, her eyes glistening with tears. "I couldn't have done it without you." As they sit in comfortable silence, the camera pans out, capturing the peaceful scene. The screen fades to black, and a final message appears. "Never stay silent in the face of injustice, for silence is complicity. But fight with love, for love is the only force that can truly change the world."